Welcome, everybody. I am my name is Dr. Ruth Almy. I am the program director at the Holocaust Awareness Museum and Education Center, who is putting on today's program. And at this time, I'm going to welcome you all to our Black History Month event, Erasing the Silence, with our speaker, Mary Romney-Schaab. And I'm going to turn it over to start out the program with Philadelphia Councilmember Isaiah Thomas, who has partnered with us on this program. We're very excited that he's here. So Councilmember Thomas.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Doctor, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for joining us here today. Again, my name is Councilmember Isaiah Thomas. I'm a council member at large in the city of Philadelphia, which means I represent the entire city of Philadelphia. And I did take a moment to put all of my information in the chat feature, so you can feel free to follow me on social media or email myself. And if myself or folks in my office can be of any service, we are here to serve. That is what we do 7 days a week. But I'm excited for this particular conversation today because as a member of City Council, one of the things that I've been trying to persuade people to recognize and understand is the importance of people's lived experiences. We all are different. We all come from different walks of life, different communities, different neighborhoods. We grow up different. We have different religions, different ethnicities, gender preferences, sexual preferences, and more. And for me, I think it's imperative that we recognize that these differences, while make us different, also draws us together when we take the time to listen and understand what people are going through, who they are, and what they've experienced. It can put us in a position to improve the entire human race in general. So I'm excited for this conversation because I think it's extremely important. One thing that I'm extremely proud of that we were able to accomplish is a legislation around driving and motor vehicle codes and enforcing motor vehicle code violations in the city of Philadelphia. Later this month, the Driving Equality Bill, which is the first in the nation, will be implemented into law here in the city of Philadelphia. And the reason I bring that up is because throughout the entire time, there were countless people who would communicate to me that they did not feel like it was an issue as it relates to law enforcement pulling people over. And what I tried to convince people on a consistent basis is that we have to, at some point, begin to respect people's lived experiences. When people are telling us what they've experienced, what their parents experienced, what their grandparents and other ancestors experienced, and we try to rectify those issues, we can't tell people that they didn't experience what they experienced. And we have to move to a space and a place where we have more sympathy and empathy when people communicate different things that have taken place in their lives, as well as those who put them in a position to be here today. So I'm excited for this conversation. I appreciate the opportunity to partner with all the different organizations and people who put this together. And we have some brilliant minds who's going to educate us. So I'm going to stop talking and pull my pen out and begin to take notes. And I hope everyone else does too. Again, I'm Councilmember Isaiah Thomas. I'm excited to be here. I put my information again in the chat feature. So if there's anything that I can do or my office can do to help, we're here. Thank you, everybody. We appreciate you. And again, let's pull our pens out and our thinking caps and let's get ready to learn.
All right, thank you so much, Councilmember Thomas. And I'm going to throw it now to one of our Hammock partners, Fabulous Flores, who is a master's student in history at Stockton University, to introduce today's speaker.
Hello, everyone. As an emerging Holocaust scholar, I set out to do my thesis on a lesser studied group, which is the Black survivors of the World War II era and the Holocaust. It was during this time of my research that I was fortunate enough to become acquainted with Mary and her father's story. During the time that I've known her, I've become more enlightened to the importance of oral histories to families and communities. So it's with great pleasure and excitement that I'm happy to present to you Mary Romney-Schaab.
Thank you very much, Fabulous. And thank you, Councilman Thomas. I'm greatly honored by your presence. Good afternoon to everyone in attendance. I thank all of you so much for being here today and for your interest in my father's story. Before I begin, I would just like to say that it's a great honor to be hosted by the Holocaust Awareness Museum and Education Center, or HAMMOC. I deeply admire HAMMOC's mission, which I believe is centered around awareness and education. And I hope that this presentation will broaden awareness and encourage further learning. I would also like to thank the people at Hammock who have been so amazingly supportive and working with me to make today possible. And they are Abby Gilbert, Dr. Ruth Almy, Jeff Quinn, and Fabulous Flores. I'm so grateful to Fabulous for originally introducing me to Hammock. So thank you very much to all of you. I'm more grateful than I can say, than I can put into words right now. So I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, they're looking good, Mary. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about an Afro-Caribbean in the Nazi era. The Afro-Caribbean is the gentleman in this picture. His name was Lionel Romney, and he was my father. But more specifically, I'm going to be talking about oral history and family history. And then I'll show you where and when my father lived. And after that, I will outline my father's World War II experience, followed by some brief background on the Nazi era and Mauthausen, which is the concentration camp where my father was imprisoned. And then in his own words, you will hear my father talking about his experience at Mauthausen. And after that, I will take you inside Mauthausen where I visited. I'll then make a brief comment about trauma and healing, and I will conclude with a word about why I wrote my book about my father's wartime experience. Now, because it was oral history that provided me access to my father's story, I'd like to spend a bit of time discussing it, starting with a definition of oral history as the intersection of a person's lived experience with historical events and recorded interviews of the person talking about that intersection. So as such, oral history creates a bridge between individual human experience and historical events. Oral history also democratizes history by reminding us that it belongs to everyone, not just famous people. It puts a human face on history, and it personalizes history by describing it from the perspective of an eyewitness. So oral history is really a kind of personal narrative. And I just want to digress for a moment and say that possibly the most famous example of personal narrative was written by this young girl. She was one of the most iconic figures in World War II history. And of course, this is Anne Frank, who wrote her diary. So you would say, but this is not oral history. And I would say, well, that's true. But it is personal narrative. And it is testimony to the power of personal narrative. The diary of Anne Frank humanizes the war, and it makes it personalized. It personalizes the historical context in which it was written. It brings history to life. Now, returning to oral history, it has an importance for Black families and all oppressed peoples because Black history has largely been neglected, omitted, remained untold, excluded, and misrepresented. The exclusion of Black history from the mainstream, especially from history books, is a significant element of systemic racism because it makes Black people invisible to others and to ourselves. And it creates the impression that we did not have a role in certain chapters in history. For many people, the purpose of oral history is to gain a deeper understanding of your family's history and the influence of history on your family, your family's role in history, your own personal history or your roots, and this leads you to deeper self-knowledge. It also gives you a way to connect older generations of your family with future generations of your family. So for all of these reasons, when my parents were in their late 70s and early 80s, I decided to embark on my oral history project with them. Plus, at that age, their health and their memories were at risk of becoming more fragile. So I wanted to make sure that I could access their recollections while their memories were still intact. Now, from my father, I wanted to find out about our family history and the history of St. Martin, because there were almost no history books about St. Martin, but our oral history went in many more directions than I ever thought it would. And he told me stories that I never thought he would reveal. While I was recording my father's oral history, I found that what he told me about World War II and the Nazi era really brought history to life for me. It inspired me to learn so much more than I ever would have if he had not built a bridge from his experience to that episode in history. So in that sense, it also brought life to history for me. So oral history brings history to life, and it brings life to history. So again, this is my father's name, Lionel Romney, and this is when he lived and his life in geographical terms. Now, rather than explain it all, I'll just say that number 1 is meant to represent the Dutch side of the island of St. Martin in the Caribbean, where my father was from. And number 2 is meant to represent the island of Aruba, the island of Curacao, and also Venezuela, which are 3 more places where my father lived in his pre-war life. So now I'm going to outline my father's World War II experience as he told it to me in his oral history. Now, as a civilian, he was a sailor on cargo ships sailing between the Caribbean, North America, and Europe from the mid-1930s until 1940. And in June 1940, he was aboard the SS Makkis, which was a Greek merchant ship sailing through the Mediterranean from Cardiff in Wales on its way to Greece. So when the ship reached the area between Tunisia and Sicily, it struck a floating mine. As you know, a mine is an explosive device. And when it struck the mine, it sank. But the crew was rescued by the Italian Navy. So this is Tunisia, and this is Sicily. So when the ship got to the area between Tunisia and Sicily, somewhere around here in these waters, it struck a mine and it sank. So when the Italian Navy rescued them, that was how my father became a political prisoner in Italy. So for the next 4 years, he was transferred through a series of internment camps in Italy. And he was there until 1944, when he was deported from this area in Italy to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria, which was right there. And he remained a prisoner there for almost a year until the camp was liberated by the US Army at the end of the war. So before I tell you about that specific experience, I have a few questions for you about genocide and the Nazi era. Throughout the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be asking you some questions. So especially for the students in the audience, keep thinking about your answers, because we're going to return to them at the end during the Q&A. So this is the first set of questions. Where and when was the first genocide of the 20th century? Who perpetrated it? Who did the Nazis specifically target for genocide? And how many did they kill? So think about how you would answer these questions and try to remember your answers and write them down if you would like to. And this is just you comparing your knowledge to what you hear in the presentation. So I will address these questions. Okay. As you know, the Nazi era was particularly notorious for genocide, but the Nazi era and the Holocaust were not the first genocide of the 20th century. Interestingly enough, the first one was also perpetrated by the Germans in 1904 in what is now Namibia in Southern Africa. The victims were the indigenous Herero ethnic group. About 80,000 of them were killed in that genocide. But in the Nazi era, for the first time in history, homicide and genocide were industrialized. And this was carried out by Hitler's Nazis through a system of concentration camps where 6 million innocent Jewish civilians were killed, and 5 million others were also included in the genocide. Now, these 5 million others included Roma and Sinti, Slavic peoples, the handicapped, and homosexuals. And all of these groups, the Jews and all of these groups were considered to be subhuman by the Nazis. The 5 million also included criminals, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, and political opponents. So 11 million of those in the specifically targeted civilian populations were killed simply because of who they were, how they were born, their behavior, and what they believed in. Now, Mauthausen had all of these populations, plus all the countries of Europe were represented among the prisoners, plus every continent as well. So the prisoner population at Mauthausen was very diverse. So who would you say is missing from the list of specifically targeted groups? Who else would you expect to see on the list? Well, a lot of you are probably thinking that you would expect to see Black people on the list. Now, when you consider that the Nazis were white supremacists on steroids, it's ironic to find that they did not specifically target Black people. Now, that does not mean that Black people were not included in the abuse, murder, and imprisonment of the concentration camp system, because thousands of them were. My father was one of them. But the Nazis just didn't put any resources into targeting them. Right now, I just want to digress a bit further, very briefly, and ask you to think about another question. Who do you think the Nazis went to for advice on how to suppress minorities? Who would know about that? Well, you're probably thinking that they went to the US. And if that's what you're thinking, you would be right. Hitler sent a delegation of Nazis to the US to study and observe the policies of racial segregation so that the same system could be implemented in Germany against the Jews and other minorities. And I mention this because it's Black History Month, and I think that this is testimony not only to the efficacy of the system of racial segregation in the United States, but also to its international reputation. So 2 more questions for you, and these are about the concentration camps. So, was there only one kind of concentration camp? Were they all the same? So again, just think for a moment about how you would answer that question from the knowledge that you have presently. Now, I just want to say a word about Mauthausen within the context of the Nazi era. So there were several different kinds of concentration camps. There were death camps, also known as extermination camps. There were labor camps, prison camps, women's camps, transit camps. But Mauthausen was unique in the concentration camp system. It was the only death through work camp. It was the only concentration camp that was specifically designated to work its prisoners to death. About 200,000 people were imprisoned there over the life of the camp. About 90,000 of them were worked to death, tortured to death, starved to death, and died in other ways, which I'll show you in a moment. The camp was constructed in 1938 because of the quarry. It sat right on top of the largest granite quarry in Austria. And the Nazis built a concentration camp there because they needed a captive labor force to work the quarry and extract the granite. So a few more questions now about Hitler and about the location and number of concentration camps. So, was Hitler German? Where was he born? Where were the concentration camps? Were all the concentration camps in Germany? How many concentration camps were there? So again, think about how you would answer these questions. So just for some geographical context, this is Mauthausen, which is near the Czech border or the Czechoslovakian border. And Mauthausen is near Linz. And Linz is famous or infamous because it was the birthplace of Hitler. This is Auschwitz, which was the largest and most notorious of all the concentration camps. I show you this map to illustrate the geographical dimensions of the concentration camp system, which extended from the Netherlands and France in the west all the way over to Belarus and Ukraine in the east. And you can see several camps up in Latvia and of course here in Poland. Czechoslovakia had concentration camps. Of course, Germany, you would expect to see camps in Germany. And as I pointed out, the Netherlands and France. So would you say that this is the total number of camps? Do you think there could have been more? Well, let's see. So this is approximately the same map as the previous screen, but it shows you more camps. It looks like over 100 camps here on this map. So do you suppose that this is the total number? Because each square dot is a camp. But no, it's not the total number. It's only the major camps. There were over 10,000 camps in the entire concentration camp system, and they were in the countries on the previous map. So again, here's Mauthausen, and here is Auschwitz. So the concentration camp system was monstrous in every way. My father witnessed the destruction of human life every day that he was at Mauthausen, and he was always wondering if he would be next. The result was that he was deeply traumatized by his experience there, so much so that he was virtually silent about it for over 40 years. But finally, in 1989, he began to talk about it. I never thought he would because it had taken me over 20 years to get him to talk about it. So I want to play a few short excerpts from his very first conversation about his internment at Mauthausen. And this was from the first oral history interview that we had together.
And so then after the war, where were you when the war ended?
I was in the camp in Austria.
In Austria, not in Germany.
No, in Germany, in Austria.
In
We came in
Austria.
from Italy. They took us to Austria.
By train,
Yeah, cattle, what the hell you call it?
a cattle car.
Yeah, cattle car.
Yeah.
Everybody, what a bundle in there.
And where in Austria?
We're up in the place is near to Graz. That's a concentration camp, one of those notorious concentration camps, Mauthausen. It's up on the hill. They had the crematoriums the camps, you know. The barracks like thing, you know, so many people in the barracks. So we were liberated in 1945, the 10th of May.
10th of May.
1945. About a couple of days before Hitler died.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh, that's interesting.
We were liberated by the Fifth Army, the American Fifth Army.
A couple of days afterwards?
A couple of days before Hitler died.
Did you ever have any close calls?
Were you ever in, what kind of danger would you say you were in during that time?
Every day was dangerous. There wasn't a day that wasn't, you know, considered. Sometimes you said, so how the hell they gonna get out of here? And then we heard some of the, you know, different things from the atrocities that the Germans was committing in the camps. Like before they leave, they kill everybody.
Right.
See if they have to run away. But we were up close to the place in Austria where we were. It was close to the Czechoslovakian border.
Uh-huh.
You can hear the Russian cannonading, and you can hear the concussion from the artillery, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Now, in the next excerpt, you will hear him talking about his constant fears and wondering if he would be the next one to die and what it was like to be a captive. He also imitates the SS guards speaking in German. As you know, the SS was an elite military corps that guarded the camps. The SS was responsible for many of the atrocities committed in the concentration camp system.
The most fearful part was in the night when I came, the SS man would come and they might call up a number, 7,700, upstate! Get up. You fight like hell because you don't know when they're going to call your number. You take the kid out, you don't see him anymore.
Right.
Night, the lights is off.
Right.
Let's roast! Upstate. Unwritten. Come on. Then I used to come in every day, twice a day, in the morning and the afternoon, to check to see if anybody had away.
Right. Did a lot of people escape?
No, you can escape. I mean, maybe some people did escape, but they tracked them down. You see? But I mean, the people in the lager, you couldn't escape. Once you got in there, they had the guards in the big, they have electric wire all around the wall, and a guardhouse there, a guardhouse there. And they had some of the prisoners in the lock in the camp. So they come and check to see if there was in there. Then you had to line up, and you had to put off the hand, have the SS man come in, take off. Sitting up.
Now, I visited Mauthausen for the first time in 2006. Of course, it's now a museum. So I want to take you inside and show you the quarry, the Stairway of Death, a crematorium, and the prisoner classification system. So this is what the camp looked like when it was in operation. And the red buildings are the only ones that are still standing today. Now, you heard my father talk about the barracks. So these are the prisoner barracks. And this is barrack number 9, which was my father's assigned barrack. I was able to walk in this space because all of the places where the buildings once stood are marked. So I was able to find barrack number 9 and walk through that space, which was a very emotional experience for me, but I wanted to do it because it gave me a chance to possibly walk in my father's footsteps. And the SS barracks were out here, and this is now a memorial monument park. If you walk along this footpath, you will come to this stairway, which is called the Stairway of Death, and it leads down onto the floor of the quarry. It's about, I would say, half a kilometer long and maybe half a kilometer wide, something like that. And the floor of the quarry is about 50 meters below the level of the camp. If you remember, I told you that the camp sits on top of the quarry. And this is what I meant, that the quarry is down here, the camp was up here. And 50 meters, I say it's 50 meters below. 50 meters is something over 150 feet. So it's almost like a big hole. And this is a ledge, which is very important. I'll explain why in just a moment, but this is a ledge here, this darker line there. And I mentioned the Memorial Monument Park, which is here. Each country in Europe that had citizens who perished in the camp has a memorial monument to those citizens. And another country that has a memorial monument is the state of Israel, and the Israeli monument is here, right, you could say really right on the ledge. And this is what that monument looks like. So this is the Israeli monument to all the Jewish people who perished at Mauthausen. And this sign says Stairway of Death. So you walk in that direction along that path, and you come to the Stairway of Death, which nowadays looks like this when you stand at the top and you look down onto the floor of the quarry. And from approximately the same vantage point, you can look out over the quarry. This is what it looks like nowadays. And this is the ledge that I was talking about. This is the ledge. And this is the 50 meters or more than 150 feet from the top of the ledge down to the floor of the quarry. So more than a 150-foot drop from the top to the bottom. And you see these trees here, and you see this little structure just to the left of the trees. Well, this structure is this monument. So why do you think that the Israelis might have put their monument here? Why do you suppose they chose this spot for their monument? Well, I think it was because one of the most common ways of torturing, intimidating, and killing prisoners, especially Jewish prisoners, was to throw them over the ledge. The SS threw prisoners over the ledge. So the quarry was an instrument of death in several ways, and this was one of them. And then when you go down the Stairway of Death and you look up, this is what it looks like nowadays. And this is what it looked like when it was in use. Now remember that the prisoners were starving. And I think the Nazis underfed them for a few reasons. And one was to keep them in a state of weakness so that they could not rebel. It's also important to remember that the Nazis' intention was to work the prisoners to death in this camp And this is one way they did it. What you see here are prisoners walking in formation up the stairway, and each one is carrying a block of granite on his back. And each block of granite weighs 50 kilos, which is 110 pounds. And since the prisoners were already weak, many of them died under the strain of carrying so much weight up these stairs. And even some of the prisoners who did not die, they would collapse from exhaustion and they would fall backwards, which caused a whole cascade of prisoners and stones falling on those behind them. So a lot of prisoners also died on this stairway in that way. So these are two reasons why it's called the Stairway of Death. And this is how my father remembered it.
They had a big gully. They had a big box on the shoulder. And the guys down there opened the stop the man. They put a big piece of stone and made them walk up from the gully up to the top. Sometimes the SS man is gone. And you couldn't walk too close to the SS man. Because once a guy jumped himself in the SS. Because he couldn't, some people were, hey, young, I'll tell you something, the young Russian guys was fearless. I wanted you sometimes you said, so where the hell a kid like this is doing in the camp? I mean, what crime can he have committed? And they didn't care. In the end of when the thing was falling, the Germans knew they was going to lose the war, even more vicious.
As I said, the prisoners were starving. So this was the condition in which many of them were found when the camp was liberated. And in this condition, they had to carry 110 pounds of stone up the 186 steps on the Stairway of Death. And these are the barracks as they look today in the museum. And you heard my father talk about the crematorium. Well, this is what it looked like. This is one of the crematoria. I think Mauthausen has 3. And this is one of them as it looked when it was in use. And this is the same one as it looks today. All throughout the entire complex, which as I say is now a museum, you see many memorial plaques to individuals and groups. This one is written in Hebrew. And you see them written in all languages, Western European languages, Eastern European languages, and others. And you see many memorial shrines consisting of votive candles and flowers and national flags. This is the Italian flag. This is the Catalan flag. And this is the prisoner identification system, or I should say the prisoner classification system for the entire concentration camp system. As you can see, it was color coded, and red was for political prisoners. Every prisoner had a triangle on his uniform, and the Jewish prisoners had 2 triangles to form a Star of David to identify them as being Jewish. And every prisoner was identified by an emblem consisting of the color of the triangle and 1 or 2 letters inside the triangle to identify his nationality or his country of citizenship, and a number under the triangle. And these emblems were on all the prisoner uniforms, which you see here. These were the uniforms for the entire concentration camp system, with the hat and the emblem on the left side of the shirt and the right pants leg. And the prisoner's number was very important because it substituted his name. You heard my father talk about how the SS would call out a number and take the prisoner to his death. So, what number do you think this is? This is the number that my father was listening for. This is his prisoner number. And any guesses on what this is? Well, this, of course, is my rendering of my father's emblem on his uniform. This was the color of his triangle, and it's red because he was a political prisoner. And this is the abbreviation for his country of citizenship, which was the Netherlands. He was Dutch because he was from the Dutch side of the island of St. Martin. And you can see his number on his concentration camp records. These are his official records. You see his number on his official records here. And this is barrack number 9, his assigned barrack. And this is how I knew to look for barrack number 9 when I went to Mauthausen. In 2005 or 2006, I got these records from the Mauthausen Memorial Department at the Austrian Ministry of the Interior. And it was a very emotionally impactful moment when we received these records in the mail. I'll never forget that. But anyway, how did you survive? Well, this was one of the first questions I asked my father when he talked about his experience in that first interview. He never answered this question, but I know that he survived because he was not assigned to work in the quarry. He was assigned to work as a lumberjack. So he spent every day outside of the camp cutting down trees. Also, he was a person of great physical and mental strength, but the main reason why he survived was probably because of his languages. Prisoners with language skills were often allowed to live longer than others because they could serve as interpreters. So he had English as a native language. He had Dutch because he was from the Dutch side of St. Martin and went to Dutch medium schools as a child. He had German because if you know Dutch, you can understand German very easily. But he learned to speak it because when he was in Italy, after the first maybe 2 years or so, the Germans came through and they took control of all of the internment camps in Italy. So he was forced into interacting with German soldiers, not the SS, just the regular army. So he learned to speak German after a while. And he also had papiamento, which is a Spanish and Portuguese-based Creole spoken on the islands of Aruba and Curacao, where my father also lived for several years. And he lived in Venezuela for a few years, where he learned Spanish. And he learned Italian very easily because of Spanish. He told me that when he first arrived in Italy, he understood everything that was said to him. And then, of course, being there for 4 years, he did learn to speak it. There were lots of prisoners at Mauthausen who spoke all of these European languages, so he was able to communicate with a lot of people. And one of his nicknames became the translator. Now, as you know, I wrote a book about my father's experience at Mauthausen, and the subtitle of my book is From Papiamento to German, and that is meant to pay tribute to the role of languages in my father's survival. It means other things as well, but that's certainly a significant part of it. Even though he survived, he was traumatized. However, oral history may have played a part in helping my father to heal. So I would like to read a passage from my book that addresses the healing power of speaking about trauma. In the absence of words, the survivor perpetually endures past trauma as present experience, but words allow him to relegate the past to its proper place. Words bring him to a safe space. And I think that's what happened to my father during our oral history interviews. I read in a book by Shoshana Feldman and Dori Laub that the listener to trauma becomes a kind of co-owner of the trauma. But I believe that I came into full co-ownership of my father's trauma only when I visited Mauthausen. But somehow, in the same way that oral history was healing for my father, my experience at Mauthausen and then writing the book brought peace to me. So again, reading from my book, visiting Mauthausen brought me to a place of peace with my father's experience there. I have never seen my father as a World War II hero, but rather as a victor. Although he was a victim of the Nazis, he was also a victor. His victory was in his survival. Knowing this, I can gratefully be at peace. I feel that Maya Angelou also said it in one of her poems. This is just an excerpt from that poem, but she said, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." In addition to bringing me to a place of peace, I also wrote my book for a few other reasons. Among them are that I wanted to weave another thread into the tapestry of African diaspora history in order to help complete the picture, because so much of it is missing. We as African diaspora people have to take control of and responsibility for our own narrative. It is because others have appropriated our narrative for so many centuries that we have not been in control of it. And oral history helps us take that control. Also, I wanted my book to be an example of how everyone has participated in and been a witness to historical events. And I wanted my book to serve as an example to others and encourage them to pursue oral histories with their families. My father's experience was an example of an untold story that only came to light because of oral history. So this is my father, immediately after the end of the war, somewhere in Europe. So in closing, I would just like to say that I hope that my experience with oral history will encourage you and others to embark on oral history projects with your families and members of your communities. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was wonderful. And I hope everyone in the audience learned a lot. At this time, I'm going to be putting a link in the chat for where anyone in our audience could find Mary's book if they want to get it for themselves. So look for that in the chat. And then Fabulous, I believe you are going to be going through questions, the Q&A. So if you have any questions for Mary, let's take a few minutes to put those in the Q&A, and we will start going through that portion of the program now. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
And for any educators out there, any teachers, Ruth will be putting her email in the chat as well. If you guys could please just send her an email with the name of your school and how many of the attendees or students attended the event, that would be great. So Mary, we do have one question so far, and it is, was your father tattooed with a number, as were some of the Jews during the Holocaust?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. He was not, because my understanding is that the tattoos were used at Auschwitz. So Mauthausen didn't tattoo its prisoners. No.
That's correct. I think it's very common. It's a very common misconception where people think that most survivors or any survivor that went through a camp would have a tattoo, but that's not the case at all. Next question is, what was the percent of people of color? And if you don't have an answer for that, I can take it if you want.
Mm-hmm. The percent of people of color as victims of the Nazis, or in Mauthausen? At Mauthausen, it was very low. I don't really remember there is some research that has been done about that, but I don't know even if the percentage is known. One problem was the way prisoners were classified. The nationality was extremely important. So sometimes, for example, if there was a prisoner from Senegal, he wouldn't be classified necessarily as Black, even though that was his race. He would be classified as French, which was his nationality, because Senegal was part of France at the time, or Morocco. Same thing with the Moroccan prisoners. A lot of them were, or they were all classified as French, and their race was not necessarily listed in the records. We were lucky with my father's records. He was listed as Black, even back in Italy. Oh no, in Italy they misclassified his race, but I don't know. I know that there were approximately 50,000 Black people who were victims of the Nazis in concentration camps. Does that comply with what your research has found, Fabulous? Or
Yes, basically. As I said earlier in the presentation, Black people in the Holocaust and just the World War II era in general, in relation to the camps and how they were persecuted under Nazi policy, is just severely under-researched. The numbers that we do have are guessing numbers, and then a lot of numbers we can't, as Mary said, because of how they would have classified somebody, it's hard to tell. So for example, somebody could have been Asian and the Nazis might have seen them as a Black person and listed them in records as Black. So it's just really hard to tell. We also have, there was a lot of, because of the prejudice in America, you had a large African-American jazz community that came over who got caught up in, unfortunately, what was going on at the time. So there's, a lot of Americans in camps who then, some survived and then they came back to America. So there's also just numbers unaccounted for. And I hope that answers your question though. Let's see. We have another question that is, did your father see any other Caribbeans in the camps?
I don't think he saw any other Caribbeans. He saw two or three other Black men at Mauthausen, but I think all of them were from different places in Africa. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for your outstanding presentation. Can you speak about your mother, how your parents met, and where you grew up?
My mother was the daughter of immigrants from St. Martin. They settled in the Boston area, and my parents met sometime in the late 40s. They got married in 1950. I was born a few years after that in New York City, which is where I grew up. And was that, I'm sorry, am I answering it? Is that what they wanted to know?
Yeah, just how your parents met, where you grew up.
Yeah.
Just anything you want to share about your mother. So.
Yeah. My mother. I was for many years I had been asking. How children ask their parents about their parents' lives before the children were born, and I did that. I was always asking my parents about their childhood and their youth and all of that. My mother was very forthcoming, but my father didn't want to talk too much about it. So I kept asking him, different questions, and he would talk a little bit about it. And as I got older, I began to realize that there was a gap in what he was telling me, and that gap happened to be World War II. So I asked him about where he was during the war and what he was doing and this and that, and he never answered. So finally, I asked my mother. And it was my mother who told me that he had been, she said he was in a German concentration camp. And I was extremely shocked to hear that. Nothing could have prepared me for that. I had absolutely no idea. And she said, he suffered a lot. He suffered so much that he can't bear to talk about it. He doesn't want to talk about it at all. So you must never ask him, and you must never let him know that you know. And of course, I was burning with curiosity, but I couldn't let him know that I knew. So I had to manipulate him into telling me. And it took me over 20 years. But the point I'm trying to make is that it was my mother who initially told me about his involvement in the war. And she didn't know much because he didn't give her much information either. So she knew very little, and she told me the little bit that she knew. But so that's just a long way of talking about my mother and her role in this.
Thank you. Does your father have any health conditions due to the living conditions during the Holocaust?
He probably did, but he was very strong. So I don't know. I don't think that whatever the ways in which he suffered physically were very clear, were very obvious. So I really don't know. He must. I mean, I don't think that he could have emerged from that without some kind of physical. Well, without some kind of physical influence. I really don't think so, but I don't know that for sure.
I am shocked by the number of smaller camps. Why isn't this more commonly known? Were they not death camps?
Well, there were so many different kinds of camps, you know. In the Italian system, those could be considered concentration camps, but they didn't exist for the same purpose. They didn't exist for the purpose of annihilating the prisoners. They were mostly there just to contain them until the Germans could come through and take them to the areas where the concentration camps were. And then there were, you know, some of the camps inhabited pre-existing structures. So that would also determine what was done with the prisoners. But there were different types of camps, and some of them were, as you say, very small, and some of them were larger, like Auschwitz. Nothing was larger than Auschwitz, but Mauthausen was a major camp. So I don't know why it's not well known in this country. Mauthausen is very well known in Europe, very well known. Whenever I'm over there and I tell people about my father's experience, they know almost as much about Mauthausen as I do. So I'm not sure why this is not known to a greater extent.
Great. So I do see some of you are putting questions in the chat instead of the Q&A. So I'm just going to jump over to the chat real quick to try and go back and answer or read some of the questions from the chat. This might have been answered and I missed it, but what brought your father to Europe from the Caribbean?
My father was a merchant sailor. He was a sailor on merchant ships. And, you know, these were ships that had to carry merchandise all over the world. So he had come into Cardiff on a merchant ship from Nova Scotia. And he was trying to get on another ship to go back across the Atlantic away from the war zone. But all of the ships and shipping companies that needed crews to go east of the United Kingdom, you know, to carry cargo to the east, they were all looking for each one was looking for a crew, but it was impossible to find a crew. It was impossible to find sailors because none of the sailors wanted to go into the war zone. They all wanted to go west, like my father did. So my father was looking for a ship that would take him west, couldn't find one. And finally, he thought he had found a ship. It was a Greek merchant ship. And he was told that that ship was going to Argentina with a load of coal. So he boarded that ship thinking that it would take him across the Atlantic away from the war. But the reality was that the ship was headed toward Greece. And when he and the rest of the crew found out that they were actually going into the war zone instead of going away from it, it was too late. So he was deceived. Whoever hired him lied to him and the rest of the crew just so that they could get people to work the ship. So it happened because it happened really, you could say, almost by accident. He was deceived into getting onto that ship. So that's how he got caught in the war.
Got it. Another question is, as someone who studied history in undergrad and is currently studying public policy, do you think oral history should have a role in public policy? And what changes to policy do you think your father's story could and should provoke?
Well, I think that oral history should have a role because it's the only kind of history that is accessible to a lot of communities, as I say. You know, and this is true on a worldwide basis. There are many languages that have no written form. So, and including in this country, a lot of Native American languages, or no Native American language has a written form. They might have an adopted written form. You know, the Roman alphabet might be imposed on some of those languages so that they can be preserved. But I feel that oral history is definitely undervalued on a worldwide basis. And it should definitely have a role in public policy. And I think it probably has to start, I think it has to start with academia. I think, you know, if people in academia study and teach oral history and ways of collecting and valuing and using oral history to teach the rest of history, to teach other areas in history, I should say, then I think that might help. But I don't really know what specific policies need to be implemented. But I definitely think that oral history is undervalued as a source, a very valuable source of information. And it's undervalued partly because of who would rely on it. I mean, the people whose history is contained in oral history are people whose contributions to society are not usually valued. So I think that a lot needs to change in order for oral history to gain the role that it deserves.
Great, thank you.
I just want to say, by the way, that these are excellent questions. I'm really enjoying all of them. I keep forgetting to compliment all of these wonderful questions, both in the chat and in the Q&A. And eventually, I would like to know from people in the audience about how they answered the questions that I was asking during the presentation, and if some of their how some of their answers compared to the information that they heard in the presentation, if they were surprised by anything that they heard in the presentation.
So we have another question here, and it says, is there any information whether or not Black people were used, especially in some of the medical experiments ongoing in various camps? If you are unable to answer that, I have an answer for it. So
I am unable.
okay.
I don't know anything about the medical experimentation, but I think it's very reasonable to think that Black people were included in medical experimentation, absolutely.
Okay. So yes, there's actually a lot of experimentation going on with Black people. So to backtrack a bit, like Mary mentioned in her presentation, there was a genocide a generation after, or generation prior in Africa by the Germans, where they had concentration camps there, and a lot of the doctors who would go on to be doctors in the Third Reich were doctors in those camps, and they performed medical experiments on the people of their colonies, the Africans there. During World War II and the Holocaust time, the Nazis had an eventual plan that once they finished in Europe, they wanted to take over Africa. Because of that, they performed a lot of medical experiments on Black people, on Black people's blood, and because they wanted to figure out how Germans could thrive in the same kind of environments that Black people thrived in. And, of course, when I say this, everyone out there should be aware that a lot of Nazi policy and thinking was rooted in racism. So there was even on up until I want to say 2004, 2006, German archives continued to hold skulls and skeletal remains from Black people who were part of these experimentation. So yes, they were very much so part of that.
And before the Nazis, there was the whole sterilization campaign in Germany. I don't know if you want to mention that, but I don't know too much about that because it was before the Nazi era. But they did sterilize the children of Black soldiers and German women, or African, I think they were all African, yeah, the African soldiers and German women. I don't know if you
covered it. Yes, that was also, she covered it. They're referred to.
Yeah, that's not experimentation, but it's similar.
Yes. So moving on from that, did your father ever comment on the issue of Holocaust denial?
Not much, but he was aware of it, and it infuriated him. In fact, it infuriates me. I don't even know how to begin to characterize something like that. I mean, it's so far beyond insult. It's so far beyond injury to deny what happened in history. Those who deny history are condemned to repeat it, right? So I just feel that, well, to answer the question, he didn't speak much about it, but he was incredulous that anybody could deny something that had not only affected so many people, but that he himself had experienced firsthand. So.
Great. Next question says, great presentation. Thanks for sharing your history and encouraging to learn more from oral history. Can you say more about what the Nazis learned from the US about racial discrimination?
I cannot say very much, but the system of racial segregation in the United States, I just never realized that it had that level of international fame or infamy. I was very surprised to find that it was known that widely in the world outside of the United States. But it was clearly very effective. And I guess that when Hitler sent that delegation to this country, they probably concentrated on the South, but they didn't have to, because the North was full of segregation as well. But I really don't know exactly what they learned, but whatever they observed and what they learned, and I mean, even if they limited themselves to observing what they saw around them, that alone would have been enough. But if they actually read the laws, the combination of seeing the implementation of those laws and looking at the laws themselves, what would have taught them really a huge amount. They would have learned pretty much, I would say, everything that they needed to know, almost everything that they needed to know to implement those policies in Germany. But I don't know.
I can comment on that a little bit more as a historian. So the Nazis definitely did look at the American Jim Crow laws as a model. In fact, they, in certain cases, thought that they went a little too far and didn't take them as far as the American laws had. The Nazis also looked at Imperial Britain as a model for a lot of what they tried to do, particularly with imperial expansion. It was interesting to look back historically and see that a lot of the sort of biggest foes of the Nazis in the war were countries that the Germans and Hitler had been looking at as a model for what they were trying to do. There's an interesting little historical tidbit there.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
All right. And the next question is, how did your father react to the liberating forces of the camp, the American military?
Well, I know more about how they reacted to him. They thought that he was one of them. They thought that he was American. They mistook him for an American. And I think that that was because they could hear that his native language was English. Again, everything was very segregated. So white people in the United States knew nothing about Black people because they were so busy staying separate from them. So even though he had that accent, or maybe they just didn't give him a chance to say very much, but I'm sure that he didn't tell them that he was American. They just assumed it. And I think that they assumed it because they could hear that his native language was English. So, you know, not knowing anything about Black people and not knowing that Afro-Caribbean people are largely English speaking, you know, they just thought that he was American. I mean, you know, it was so unlikely that somebody from St. Martin would be in that camp. They just assumed he was American and they took him with them. So I'm sure that he was glad to see them, but he really didn't say much about that. He talked much more about how they perceived him.
Right. Kind of going off of that, this question asks, how did your father get entry into the US after the war? Did the authorities try to repatriate him to St. Martin?
Well, he had family in this country because people in those days used to emigrate from St. Martin a lot. Even his parents' generation, they emigrate. A lot of people in that generation emigrated. And that's why he himself couldn't go back there because there was no work. The economy was very, very small. So he had family in New York. So that's how he came to live there, through his family there. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And this is a comment, and it says, this is very common as a second generation, about not asking our parents about what they went through. They were protecting us and we were protecting them by not speaking or asking questions.
Absolutely. Quite often, you know, I mean, I tell people to do, I tell everybody to do oral histories with their elderly. And they often say to me, yeah, but they don't want to talk. You know, I ask them and they say, oh, I don't want to talk about it. And that's a very typical reaction. I mean, look at my father, you know, he wouldn't talk to me about it for over the 20 years, the more than 20 years that I was asking him. But what this person said is true. They don't want to talk about it because they don't want to hurt you, because consciously or subconsciously, they know that if they suffered and they tell you about that it will hurt you. And they don't want that. They don't want to share that suffering. And what I read in a book on trauma theory was that, and I put it in this presentation, that the listener to trauma becomes a co-owner of the trauma. So your parents know that consciously or subconsciously. Another reason why they don't want to talk about it, why it's hard to get your parents to talk about it, is because they don't want you to judge them. again, that could be subconscious, but they might feel that they will be judged by the listener. So they don't want to hurt you. They don't want you to judge them. It's emotionally very, very difficult to access this. So what I always recommend is strangers. Get strangers to ask your elderly about their experiences and record those conversations. They'll talk to strangers much more easily than they'll talk to you as the child, because they don't have that emotional relationship with the stranger. I mean, when I say strangers, I mean strangers to the old people, not strangers to you. So get, a friend of yours or anybody who you know and can trust, and who will ask the questions that you want answers to. I find that is a very effective way of getting these people to talk, because it's really difficult. This is painful. It's very painful for them, but it's much more painful if they don't talk about it. That's the key. Talking about it relieves the pain enormously. Because if they don't talk about it, it festers, and that's much worse. It's like an infection. So I appreciate that comment.
So you kind of already answered this question in what you were just saying, but I'll still ask it in the event that you have anything else you want to add, which is, how did you get your father to share his experience?
Well, I don't know, but it did happen in front of a stranger. The lady. I couldn't afford video equipment in those days. This was the late 80s, and home video equipment was still very expensive. I couldn't afford it. So I had somebody come in and do the recording for us. And I think partly because he was in front of a stranger and he was in front of a camera, because in those days the cameras were big. We used to have these things called VHS tapes, and they were big. So the camera was not something that could be discreetly tucked away next to you or some other place. They weren't like that. So I feel that because he was in front of objective observers, or people that weren't necessarily people and objects that weren't going to necessarily judge him, and with whom he had no emotional relationship, I think that facilitated his opening up. But I really don't know. I don't know what makes people do these things when they do them.
And then we just had a comment that said, another reason elders may not share is shame. Absolutely. Yeah. They don't, a lot of them don't want to be seen as victims. They don't want to be seen as weak. There's so much pain involved in a lot of this, but again, it's more painful if they don't talk about it. They don't realize that. They think that they're suppressing the pain by keeping it silent, but it's only when you let it escape that you can escape from it. So the next question is, where do you lecture or teach this very special look into the Holocaust? I'm a retired teacher, and I am very happy to do this, to give this presentation to people that are interested. I think I put my email in the presentation, but I can put it in the chat. So anybody who's interested can always email me, but I don't do it. I'm doing it a lot this month because this is Black History Month, but I don't do it on a regular basis. I just do it on request when people are interested, but I am a retired teacher. While I was teaching, I didn't do it that much because it's not my subject area. I'm not a historian. I'm not a professional historian. I'm not an expert in oral history.
My profession is the teaching of English to speakers of other languages. So it's not related to any of this, but I find this history so fascinating, and I believe so deeply in oral history that I have spent some time researching and trying to learn a little bit about oral history. I don't know much.
Did your father's experience in Mauthausen have any effect on his experience as a Black man living in the United States while it was still struggling with segregation and civil rights?
I don't know if mentally he compared the experiences, but again, that's another excellent question. You know, the people in my parents' generation, and maybe there are still some people today, those people lived most of their lives before the civil rights movement. So that means that they had absolutely no protection, they had no legal recourse when their civil rights were being violated. I mean, you know, you would say that things today are not very good and this and that. That's all true, but things before the civil rights movement, you know, if you didn't experience that, which I did not, or, you know, not much before the civil rights movement. I was a young child when the civil rights movement was going on. So I don't really have a memory of life before that, but, you know, I admire the people in my parents' generation and all those previous generations. And again, you know, maybe some of the older people today, because they had no protection from the injustices that they were experiencing, absolutely none. All they had was their own internal resources. They had nothing else. We today, you know, you would say that our rights are violated routinely and things are very bad for us today. Okay, well, but at least we have legal protection, we have legal recourse, we have all kinds of resources at our disposal that did not exist in those days and to which people in those days had no access. So I really just can't help but admire the strength of people in my father's generation, my parents' generation, because they had no protection whatsoever. They had absolutely no, they had few allies. They had allies, but they had so little power and so few resources, so few rights. So probably mentally he compared it, but he didn't talk to me about it.
This might be something that you might have to answer, Ruth. It says, could we continue to communicate with all the participants about matters of the Holocaust after this initial gathering?
Well, this might be a good time for me to plug the Holocaust Awareness Museum and Education Center, which is our organization putting on this program today. We are located in Elkins Park, just north of Philadelphia. I'll put our general email address in the chat. It's info @hamec.org. So if you'd like to learn more about what we do, the programming we put on and our work as a museum in the area, feel free to contact us. We do survivor and second generation testimony programs provided to schools in the greater Philadelphia, Delaware Valley area, as well as all over the world because of the wonders of technology. And we have been so happy and excited to be working with Mary Romney-Schaab today to present her father's story and her book. And just thank you again so much, Mary. I would like to, on behalf of all of HAMEC, thank you for such a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm extraordinarily grateful to you for hosting me and for your interest in my father's story. I'm more grateful than I can say, so thank you very much. And maybe if people are interested in contacting me, they can contact HAMEC and get my.
We are absolutely happy to do that. We play that role for many survivor and second generation speakers. So if you'd like to get in touch with Mary, please feel free to contact Hammock. I've actually put my coworker, the education director, Jeffrey Quinn's email in the chat as well. If you'd like to request a program from us for your school or organization, we're happy to provide that for you. His is Jeff with a G, like the Toys R Us giraffe, at hammock.org. We've almost hit 3:30, so I think that unless Fabulous, you had one final question, I think maybe we might end the presentation here today.
Well, we can just like throw out one question. We did have like a few more left, but we can give her just one more question.
One final question, because we are
It
running
seems like
out.
it's like a yes or no, I feel.
Okay.
Was your father a member of any Mauthausen survivor organizations?
No, he wasn't. He wasn't. But I just want to thank everybody who asked questions. I want to thank everybody in the audience for attending. Of course, I want to thank Hammock again, but I want to thank those of you in the audience for attending and for such excellent questions. These have really been brilliant questions. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
I thank you everyone for joining us again. This is wonderful. And please contact Hammock if you would like to know more about us or any questions, or get in touch with Mary. And I'm going to close the program there. And thank you all for coming, and happy Black History Month. Thank you for joining us.